The church bell rings out sharply in the clear morning. The priest crosses the square and pushes open the side door without looking back. Following him, a skinny, clumsy German shepherd puppy walks among the faithful. The priest enters with a firm step, saying nothing. Doves fly up from the eaves, an old woman stops in her tracks, the sacristan stares. The animal stops in front of a perpetually empty pew, while the priest continues to the altar. Claws scratch the wood. An old piece of metal emerges from the dust. The choir begins. The puppy raises its snout toward the central aisle, and then everything holds its breath. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now we return to our story. The bell of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church echoed across the cobblestone square of Millbrook, Tennessee, as Father William Matthews made his usual Sunday morning walk from the rectory. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and fresh coffee from Martha's Diner, where early risers gathered before the 10 o'clock service. At 62, Father Bill had walked this same path for nearly 3 decades, his weathered hands clutching his worn leather Bible, his steps measured and purposeful. Today, however, something was different. A soft rustling behind him made the priest pause mid-stride. He turned, expecting to see Mrs. Henderson with her perpetually worried expression, or perhaps young Tommy Walsh, who often ran late for altar boy duties. Instead, his eyes fell upon a small German shepherd puppy, no more than 3 months old, with oversized ears and gentle brown eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young creature. The puppy's ribs showed beneath his golden and black coat, suggesting days without proper meals, yet his tail wagged with determined enthusiasm. "Well, hello there, little fellow, shh," Father Bill murmured, crouching down and extending his hand. The puppy approached without hesitation, pressing his small body against the priest's legs, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Where did you come from?" The animal offered no answer, except a soft whimper, and continued to lean against Father Bill's black slacks. When the priest straightened and resumed walking toward the church, the puppy fell into step beside him. Matching his pace with surprising precision, several parishioners, who were already making their way across the square, noticed the unusual pair, their conversations dropping to whispers as they observed the scene unfolding before them. Eleanor Richardson, the church organist for 47 years, stopped her careful descent down the church steps to watch. Her silver hair was pulled back in its customary bun, and her reading glasses hung from a delicate chain around her neck. She had seen many things in her decades of service, but never had she witnessed an animal follow Father Bill with such obvious intent. "Father Matthews," she called out, her voice carrying across the morning air, "it appears you've acquired a companion." Father Bill smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with genuine warmth. "So it would seem, Eleanor, though I'm not quite sure how it happened." The puppy looked up at both of them, his intelligent eyes moving from face to face as if following their conversation. When Father Bill resumed walking, the small dog continued alongside him, never straying more than a foot from the priest's side. By now, more members of the congregation had gathered, forming small clusters of curious onlookers. Dorothy Walsh, Tommy's grandmother and the unofficial keeper of church protocol, frowned as she watched the approaching duo. At 78, she had firm opinions about proper church behavior and had been known to correct visitors who dressed too casually or spoke too loudly in the sanctuary. A stray animal following the priest was definitely not part of the established order. "Father Bill," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "surely you're not planning to bring that creature into the house of God?" Before Father Bill could respond, the puppy had trotted directly to Dorothy, sitting politely at her feet and looking up with an expression that could only be described as hopeful. The elderly woman's stern expression faltered slightly as she found herself looking down into those earnest brown eyes. "He seems harmless enough," offered Marcus Chen, a newcomer to Millbrook who had joined the congregation only 6 months earlier. As a veterinarian, he had developed an appreciation for the intuitive nature of animals. German shepherds are known for their loyalty and intelligence. "That may be true, Dr. Chen," Dorothy replied, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. "But this is a church, not an animal shelter." The puppy remained sitting at Dorothy's feet, his tail creating small clouds of dust on the worn stone steps. Father Bill watched the interaction with growing fascination. In all his years of ministry, he had learned to recognize moments when something larger than coincidence was at work. This felt like one of those moments. "Perhaps," Father Bill said slowly, "we should see what unfolds. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, and I've learned not to question his methods too quickly." As if understanding that he had been granted permission, the puppy rose and returned to Father Bill's side. Together, they approached the heavy wooden doors of St. Matthew's. The church, built in 1887, stood as the architectural centerpiece of Millbrook's historic district. Its red brick facade and white-painted trim had weathered more than a century of Tennessee seasons, and its stained glass windows caught the morning light in brilliant splashes of blue and gold. Sarah Beth Morrison, at 28, the youngest member of the church board, watched the scene with barely contained delight. She had always been drawn to underdogs and strays, both human and animal, and something about the puppy's confident demeanor suggested this was no ordinary abandoned pet. Her husband, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison, stood beside her with his characteristic skeptical expression, though she noticed even he seemed curious about the small animal's obvious attachment to their priest. "Look how he stays right with Father Bill," Sarah Beth whispered. "It's like he belongs there." The gathering crowd created a natural semicircle around the church entrance. Some parishioners smiled with warm approval, while others exchanged glances of concern. The puppy seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on Father Bill as they reached the sanctuary doors. Father Bill paused, his hand on the ornate brass handle. He looked down at the puppy, who sat immediately, as if he had done this countless times before. The priest's mind raced with practical concerns about insurance policies and health regulations, but his heart told him something different entirely. "Well, my friend," he said quietly to the puppy, "it seems we've caused quite a stir already. Are you certain you want to continue this journey?" The puppy's only response was to stand and press closer to Father Bill's legs, his small body radiating warmth and determination. As the priest opened the church doors, the cool darkness of the sanctuary beckoned, and without a moment's hesitation, the puppy crossed the threshold into St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. The soft gasp that arose from the gathered congregation was audible even over the morning breeze. Some of the older parishioners crossed themselves reflexively, while others simply stared in wonder. Dr. Chen found himself smiling despite his usual professional reserve, and even Dorothy Walsh seemed momentarily speechless. Inside the sanctuary, the puppy's paws made soft clicking sounds on the polished hardwood floors. Morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the empty pews. The small animal moved with purpose, as if he had walked these aisles before. His nose lifted slightly as he took in the familiar scents of old wood, candle wax, and the lingering fragrance of last Sunday's flowers. Father Bill followed, his own footsteps echoing in the sacred space. He had prepared his sermon the night before, a reflection on faith and unexpected blessings. But watching the puppy navigate the sanctuary with such confidence made him wonder if perhaps the morning's events were themselves a kind of sermon. The puppy moved past the first 3 rows of pews without pause, then stopped abruptly. Father Bill watched as the small animal approached the 4th pew on the left side, specifically the section that had remained empty for the past 18 months. The priest's breath caught in his throat as memories of Benjamin Crawford flooded back. Memories of a man who had occupied that exact spot every Sunday for over 20 years until circumstances had driven him away from the congregation he had loved so deeply. With deliberate care, the puppy positioned himself in the empty space and lay down, his small head resting on his paws as he gazed toward the altar. The symbolism was not lost on Father Bill, nor would it be lost on the congregation members who were beginning to file into the sanctuary. The morning's unexpected visitor had chosen the one spot in the entire church that carried the heaviest emotional weight. The place that served as a painful reminder of words spoken in anger and trust broken beyond repair. Father Bill stood in the center aisle, his sermon notes forgotten in his jacket pocket, watching as his congregation slowly filled the pews around the small guardian of Benjamin Crawford's memory. The sanctuary filled with the quiet rustle of Sunday morning preparations as parishioners settled into their customary seats. Handbags were placed on pew floors, hymnals opened to the day's selections, and whispered conversations carried the weight of the morning's unexpected development. All eyes, however, remained fixed on the small German Shepherd puppy who had claimed Benjamin Crawford's former place with such certainty. Margaret Foster, who had faithfully occupied the pew directly behind Benjamin's for 15 years, found herself unable to focus on her bulletin. At 64, she had been one of Benjamin's strongest supporters during the difficult months that led to his departure from St. Matthew's. The sight of the puppy curled in that sacred space brought back a flood of memories she had tried desperately to bury. "It's almost like he's keeping the seat warm," she whispered to her sister Rose, who had driven down from Nashville for the monthly family visit. Rose, unfamiliar with the church's recent history, glanced at the puppy with curiosity. Keeping it warm for whom? Margaret's silence spoke volumes. The story of Benjamin Crawford was not one easily shared with outsiders, even family. It involved broken trust, misunderstood intentions, and a community's struggle between forgiveness and self-preservation. The puppy's presence in that specific location felt like a gentle but insistent reminder of unfinished business. Dr. Chen had taken his usual seat near the back of the church, where he could observe the congregation's dynamics without drawing attention to himself. As someone new to Millbrook, he had quickly learned that every small town carried its share of unspoken histories. The reaction to the puppy's choice of seating suggested he had stumbled into one of those sensitive areas where past and present intersected in uncomfortable ways. Sarah Beth Morrison leaned closer to her husband, Jake, her voice barely audible above the soft prelude Eleanor was playing on the organ. "Daddy, do you think it's just coincidence that he chose that particular spot?" Jake, trained to notice details others might miss, had been asking himself the same question. In his 3 years as Millbrook's deputy sheriff, he had learned that coincidences were often less random than they appeared. The puppy's confident navigation of the church and his deliberate selection of the most emotionally charged location in the sanctuary suggested either remarkable intuition or something beyond ordinary canine behavior. "I don't know," Jake replied, his eyes never leaving the small animal, "but I've learned not to dismiss things just because I can't explain them." Father Bill made his way to the pulpit, his usual pre-service routine disrupted by the morning's events. As he arranged his notes, he caught sight of Harold Whitfield in the third pew, his weathered face wearing an expression of deep displeasure. Harold, a retired banker who had served as church treasurer for 23 years, had been one of the most vocal critics during the Benjamin Crawford situation. His presence this morning, combined with the puppy's symbolic positioning, promised to make the service anything but routine. The puppy raised his head as the congregation stood for the opening hymn, his intelligent eyes scanning the faces around him as if taking careful note of each person's reaction to his presence. When "Amazing Grace" filled the sanctuary, The small animal settled back down, apparently content to participate in his own quiet way. Dorothy Walsh sang with her characteristic precision, her voice strong and unwavering despite her 78 years. Yet those who knew her well could detect a slight tremor in her usually rock-steady tone. The puppy's presence had stirred something in her that she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Memories of her own role in the events that had driven Benjamin away from the church he had loved so dearly. During the pastoral prayer, something remarkable occurred. The puppy, who had been lying quietly throughout the service, suddenly stood and began walking slowly down the center aisle. The congregation's collective intake of breath was audible as the small animal approached each pew methodically, his tail wagging gently as he made brief eye contact with various parishioners before moving on. When he reached Harold Whitfield's row, the puppy paused longer than he had with anyone else. Harold stiffened, his knuckles white as he gripped the pew in front of him. The small animal simply sat and looked up at him, his expression neither accusatory nor pleading, but somehow filled with understanding. Harold's face flushed red, and he found himself unable to maintain eye contact with the creature. The puppy continued his circuit, stopping briefly at Margaret Foster's pew. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as the small animal seemed to acknowledge her presence with a gentle nod before continuing his journey. When he reached Dr. Chen, the veterinarian was surprised to find himself deeply moved by the animal's direct gaze, as if the puppy was somehow thanking him for his earlier defense. Sarah Beth Morrison watched in wonder as the puppy approached her row. When he stopped and looked directly at her, she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, as if she were being entrusted with something precious and fragile. The sensation was so strong that she reached out instinctively, and the puppy allowed her to briefly touch his soft fur before continuing his rounds. By the time the small animal completed his circuit and returned to Benjamin Crawford's former seat, the entire congregation was in a state of emotional upheaval. Some wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, and a few, including Harold Whitfield, had faces set in hard lines of resistance to whatever message they feared the morning's events might carry. Father Bill, who had watched the entire episode with growing amazement, found himself departing from his prepared sermon entirely. Instead, he spoke about unexpected messengers and the ways in which divine grace could manifest in the most unlikely circumstances. His words seemed to resonate particularly strongly with those who had witnessed the puppy's deliberate interaction with each member of the congregation. Sometimes, Father Bill said, his voice carrying across the hushed sanctuary, God sends us reminders in forms we don't expect. Sometimes those reminders challenge us to look at situations we thought were closed, to examine our hearts for corners we've left unswept, to consider that forgiveness and healing might be possible even when we've convinced ourselves otherwise. The puppy lay peacefully in Benjamin's former spot, his presence somehow both comforting and disturbing to those who remembered the man who had once occupied that space with equal faithfulness. Benjamin Crawford had been a pillar of St. Matthew's community, a man whose generosity and dedication had been legendary until that terrible autumn when whispered accusations and mounting suspicions had poisoned the very air of the sanctuary. As the service concluded and the congregation began to file out, conversations erupted in small clusters throughout the church. Some parishioners approached Father Bill with questions about the puppy's future, while others hurried past with obvious discomfort. The small animal remained in his chosen spot, watching the human drama unfold around him with the patient wisdom that seemed far beyond his few months of life. Eleanor Richardson finished her postlude and approached the puppy with cautious curiosity. As she drew near, the small animal stood and walked directly to her, sitting politely at her feet and looking up with unmistakable affection. Eleanor found herself smiling despite her usual reserve around animals. "Well, little one," she said softly. "You've certainly stirred things up this morning. I hope you know what you're doing." The puppy's tail wagged as if in response, and Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. She had been at St. Matthew's long enough to remember when Benjamin Crawford had first started attending services, a young man seeking community and purpose. She also remembered the heartbreak in his eyes during those final Sundays before his departure. Dorothy Walsh approached with obvious reluctance, her practical nature warring with something softer that the puppy's behavior had awakened in her. "Father Bill," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss what happens next. The church board will have questions, and there are regulations to consider." Father Bill nodded, understanding the weight of her concerns while feeling equally pulled by the inexplicable rightness of the puppy's presence. "Of course, Dorothy, but perhaps we should first consider what we've witnessed here today. This little fellow seems to have something to teach us, and I'm not sure we should be too hasty in dismissing the lesson." As the last of the congregation departed, the puppy settled back into Benjamin Crawford's former spot, his small body creating a living memorial to absent forgiveness and the possibility of healing wounds that had been left to fester for far too long. The church board meeting that Tuesday evening carried an unusual tension as 5 members gathered in the small conference room behind the sanctuary. The puppy, who had spent the past 2 days following Father Bill throughout his daily routines, lay quietly in the corner, as if sensing the importance of the discussion that was about to unfold around him. Dorothy Walsh called the meeting to order with her characteristic efficiency, though those who knew her well could detect an underlying unease in her manner. "We're here to address the situation regarding the animal that has taken up residence in our sanctuary," she began, her eyes avoiding the puppy's gentle gaze. "There are practical considerations we cannot ignore." Harold Whitfield leaned forward in his chair, his expression stern. "This has gone far enough, Dorothy. I've been receiving calls from concerned parishioners all week. Whatever sentiment people might have about the creature, we have responsibilities. Insurance liability, health department regulations, proper church decorum. We cannot allow emotions to override common sense." Sarah Beth Morrison shifted uncomfortably in her seat. At 28, she was the youngest board member and often felt the weight of challenging more established voices. "But Harold, you saw what happened Sunday morning. The way he moved through the congregation, the way people responded. Even you have to admit there was something extraordinary about it." "What I saw," Harold replied sharply, "it was disruption and disorder. What I saw was a congregation distracted from worship by a stray animal. What I saw was the exact kind of chaos that this church cannot afford to indulge again." The room fell silent at Harold's final words. Everyone present understood the implication, the reference to the Benjamin Crawford situation that had torn through their community like a wound that refused to heal. The puppy, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere, raised his head and looked directly at Harold with those knowing brown eyes. Father Bill cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps this is an opportunity to discuss what really happened 18 months ago. Perhaps it's time we stop dancing around the truth of Benjamin's departure." Margaret Foster, who had been invited to the meeting despite not being a board member, spoke for the first time. "Benjamin Crawford was the most dedicated member this church has ever known. He organized our youth programs, managed our outreach efforts, and gave more of his time and money than anyone had a right to ask. Until the day he walked out those doors, he never missed a Sunday service in 22 years. And look where that dedication led," Harold interjected, his voice thick with old anger. "Look what we discovered about his true motivations." "We discovered nothing," Margaret shot back, her usually soft voice rising with passion. "More, we listened to gossip and speculation. We allowed suspicion to poison our judgment without ever giving Benjamin a chance to defend himself." Dr. Chen, who had been observing the exchange with professional interest, spoke carefully. As someone new to this community, I'm not familiar with the details, but I've noticed that Mr. Crawford's name creates strong reactions. Perhaps understanding what happened might help us process what's happening now. Eleanor Richardson, the church organist who had remained silent until now, looked around the table with sad eyes. Benjamin Crawford was accused of having inappropriate relationships with some of the young women in our youth group. The accusations came from anonymous sources, whispered conversations that grew louder each week until the entire congregation was buzzing with speculation. The puppy stood and walked slowly toward the table, settling himself directly between Harold's chair and the others, as if positioning himself as a barrier between opposing forces. His action was so deliberate that it momentarily silenced the discussion. Father Bill continued where Eleanor had left off. The accusations were never proven, never substantiated with actual evidence. But in a small town like Millbrook, perception becomes reality very quickly. Benjamin found himself isolated, watched, judged by people who had known him for decades. Parents began pulling their daughters from youth group activities. The fellowship hall grew silent when he entered. Because we were protecting our children, Harold defended. Because we couldn't take chances with their safety and well-being. By destroying a good man's reputation based on rumors, Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. By forcing him to choose between defending himself against false accusations or leaving the church he loved more than life itself. Sarah Beth leaned forward, her young face troubled. What kind of accusations specifically? If we're going to discuss this, we need to be clear about what actually happened. Dorothy Walsh sighed deeply, looking older than her 78 years. Parents reported that Benjamin had been spending too much time with certain girls, offering extra mentoring sessions, giving them special attention during church activities. Some said he had made comments about their appearance, their maturity. Others claimed he had touched them inappropriately during group activities, all of which Benjamin denied, Father Bill added firmly. All of which, when investigated properly, turned out to be normal interactions between a dedicated youth leader and the teenagers in his care. But by the time the truth became clear, the damage was irreversible. The puppy moved again, this time approaching Harold directly. The retired banker stiffened as the small animal sat beside his chair, not begging for attention but simply offering his presence. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. "The truth," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is that I led the campaign against Benjamin Crawford. The truth is that I organized the parents who demanded his removal from youth leadership. The truth is that I convinced the board to ask for his resignation from all church activities." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Even the puppy seemed to sense the weight of Harold's words, his intelligent eyes never leaving the man's face. "Why?" Sarah Beth asked quietly. "Why would you do that if you weren't certain of the accusations?" Harold's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Because I was afraid. Because my own granddaughter was in that youth group, and the thought of anything happening to her clouded my judgment completely. Because I chose protection over truth, suspicion over faith." Margaret Foster reached across the table and placed her hand over Harold's. "We all made choices we regret, Harold. We all contributed to what happened." The puppy rose and placed his small paw on Harold's leg. A gesture so human-like in its compassion that several board members gasped softly. Harold looked down at the animal through his tears, seeing for the first time the forgiveness that had been sitting in Benjamin Crawford's pew for the past 3 days. Father Bill spoke into the emotional silence. Benjamin Crawford never fought the accusations. He never defended himself publicly, never demanded a formal investigation. He simply said that if his presence caused pain or division in his beloved church, he would remove himself from the equation, and that's exactly what he did. "Where is he now?" Dr. Chen asked gently. "Gone," Eleanor replied sadly. "He left Millbrook 2 months after resigning from the church, sold his house, quit his job at the hardware store, disappeared without leaving a forwarding address. Some say he moved to Florida. Others think he went back to his family in Ohio. No one knows for certain. The puppy returned to his position in the corner, but his presence continued to influence the conversation. His calm acceptance of the emotional upheaval around him seemed to offer a model for how healing might begin to take place. "The question before us now," Dorothy said slowly, "is whether this little creature's presence is helping us confront our past, or simply reopening wounds that might be better left alone." Sarah Beth looked around the table at the faces of people she had known all her life, seeing them perhaps more clearly than ever before. Maybe those wounds never healed because we never properly cleaned them. Maybe this puppy is showing us that some things can't be buried. They can only be forgiven. As the meeting concluded without any firm decisions about the puppy's future, each board member left carrying the weight of Benjamin Crawford's story and their own role in its tragic unfolding. The small German shepherd remained with Father Bill, his presence a living reminder that sometimes the path to redemption requires confronting the very truths we most desperately want to avoid. The days following the board meeting brought an uncomfortable tension to Millbrook as word of Harold Whitfield's confession spread through the community with the unstoppable force of small-town gossip. The puppy, now unofficially named Gabriel by Sarah Beth Morrison, continued his daily routine of following Father Bill and maintaining his vigilant presence in Benjamin Crawford's former pew. Wednesday morning found Father Bill in the sanctuary preparing for the weekly Bible study when Gabriel suddenly rose from his usual spot and began scratching at the wooden floor beneath the pew. The priest paused in his reading, watching as the small animal clawed persistently at a particular section of the old hardwood planks. "What is it, boy?" Father Bill murmured, approaching to investigate. Gabriel's scratching had loosened a section of flooring that appeared different from the surrounding wood, as if it had been recently replaced or repaired. With growing curiosity, Father Bill knelt beside the puppy and examined the area more closely. The section of flooring lifted easily, revealing a small, hollow space beneath. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, was an object that made Father Bill's breath catch in his throat. With trembling hands, he lifted out an ornate silver communion chalice that had been missing from St. Matthew's for over 2 years. The chalice had been a treasured artifact, donated to the church in 1923 by the founding family and used in every communion service until its mysterious disappearance. The theft had been reported to the police, the insurance claim had been filed, and suspicion had fallen on various members of the community, though no charges were ever brought. Gabriel sat beside the discovery, his tail wagging slightly as if proud of his contribution to the morning's activities. Father Bill stared at the chalice, his mind racing with implications that were almost too significant to process. The timing of its disappearance coincided closely with the growing accusations against Benjamin Crawford, and its location beneath his customary seat suggested connections that the community had never considered. "Dear God," Father Bill whispered, carefully lifting the chalice from its hiding place. The silver gleamed despite its time in darkness, and etched into its base were the initials of the donor family, confirming its authenticity beyond any doubt. Dr. Chen arrived for the Bible study early, as was his custom, and found Father Bill and Gabriel in the midst of their discovery. "Father Matthews," he called out, his veterinarian's instincts immediately detecting something unusual in the priest's posture. "Is everything all right?" Father Bill held up the chalice, his face pale with shock. "Marcus, Gabriel found this hidden beneath Benjamin's pew. It's our missing communion chalice, the one that disappeared 2 years ago." Dr. Chen approached slowly, understanding immediately the significance of what they were seeing. "The one that was stolen around the time of the accusations against Mr. Crawford." The very same. Father Bill's voice carried a weight of realization that seemed to age him before Dr. Chen's eyes. Marcus, I think we may have stumbled upon evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about Benjamin's departure. As other members of the Bible study group began arriving, word of the discovery spread quickly through the small gathering. Margaret Foster was among the first to hear, and her reaction was immediate and visceral. She sat heavily in a nearby pew, her face drained of color as the implications became clear. "You think Benjamin was hiding stolen property?" asked Janet Miller, a relative newcomer to the church who had joined just months before Benjamin's departure. "No," Margaret said firmly, her voice gaining strength as her mind processed the possibilities. "I think someone else hid it there, and knowing that if it were ever discovered, Benjamin would be blamed. I think this was part of a deliberate plan to destroy his reputation." Harold Whitfield arrived as the discussion reached its peak, and the sight of the chalice in Father Bill's hands seemed to strike him like a physical blow. He sank into a pew without speaking, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of guilt and dawning understanding. Sarah Beth Morrison had been notified by her husband Jake, who had heard about the discovery through the police department's informal network. She arrived with barely contained excitement, though her expression grew somber as she processed what the chalice's location might mean. "We need to call the sheriff," Jake said quietly to Father Bill. "This is evidence in a theft case, even if it's 2 years old. There might be fingerprints, other clues that could help us understand who really took it." Father Bill nodded, though his primary concern was for the emotional welfare of his congregation. The discovery of the chalice threatened to reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal, while simultaneously offering the possibility of vindication for Benjamin Crawford. Gabriel, seemingly satisfied with his contribution to the morning's revelations, had returned to his place in Benjamin's pew. He lay down, with his head resting on his paws, watching the human drama unfold around him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than any puppy should. Eleanor Richardson arrived as the sheriff's deputies were carefully documenting the scene. She took one look at the chalice and the expressions on the faces around her and immediately grasped the significance of what had occurred. "Someone hid that chalice there intentionally," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Someone wanted it to be found eventually, wanted Benjamin to be blamed for its theft, but they never expected it would take 2 years and a stray puppy to bring it to light." Deputy Jake Morrison completed his initial report and addressed the gathered group. "We'll need to conduct a full investigation, dust for prints, check for any other evidence. But I have to say, the location and timing strongly suggest this was planted to incriminate Mr. Crawford." Harold Whitfield finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I organized the search of the church when the chalice first went missing. I insisted we look everywhere, check everyone's involvement. But I never thought to look beneath the floorboards of Benjamin's pew. None of us did, because none of us wanted to believe that Benjamin could be guilty of theft on top of everything else," Margaret added sadly. "We were so focused on the other accusations that we never questioned the timing of the chalice's disappearance." Dr. Chen, observing the scene with his outsider's perspective, voiced what many were beginning to think. If someone was willing to plant stolen property to frame Mr. Crawford, what does that say about the other accusations against him? How many of those rumors might have been deliberately started by the same person? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing each person present to confront the possibility that Benjamin Crawford had been the victim of a calculated campaign of character assassination. Gabriel's presence in Benjamin's pew seemed to take on even greater significance, as if the small animal had been sent specifically to uncover this crucial piece of evidence. Father Bill carefully placed the chalice in the evidence bag provided by the deputies, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this discovery, while potentially vindicating Benjamin, came far too late to undo the damage that had been done. Somewhere, possibly hundreds of miles away, a good man was living with the pain of false accusations and the loss of the community he had loved. As the Bible study group dispersed, each member carrying the weight of new revelations, Gabriel remained in his chosen spot. His work for the morning was complete, but his presence continued to serve as a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, even when it has been deliberately buried beneath layers of deception and fear. The question that now faced St. Matthew's congregation was whether this new evidence would be enough to heal the divisions that had torn their community apart, or whether the damage done to Benjamin Crawford's life was too extensive to ever be truly repaired. Gabriel, with his unwavering faith in the goodness of human nature, seemed to believe that redemption was still possible, even in the face of such devastating betrayal. The investigation into the communion chalice's mysterious reappearance sent shockwaves through Millbrook's tight-knit community. By Friday afternoon, Deputy Jake Morrison had interviewed nearly 24 church members, each conversation revealing new layers of the complex web that had ensnared Benjamin Crawford 2 years earlier. Gabriel continued his faithful presence at St. Matthew's, his behavior becoming increasingly purposeful as the weekend approached. Father Bill spent Friday evening in his study, poring over church records from the period surrounding Benjamin's departure. The puppy lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head when certain names were mentioned aloud. It was during this review that Father Bill discovered something troubling in the financial records that Harold Whitfield had maintained as church treasurer. "Gabriel," Father Bill murmured, looking down at the small animal, "I think we're about to uncover something that goes much deeper than a stolen chalice." The records showed several irregular transactions during the months leading up to Benjamin's departure. Money had been moved between accounts, donations had been reclassified, and there were gaps in documentation that a more thorough audit might have revealed years earlier. Father Bill's pastoral training had not prepared him for forensic accounting, but even his untrained eye could see patterns that suggested financial impropriety. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the rectory. Susan Crawford, Benjamin's younger sister, stood at Father Bill's door with tears in her eyes and a worn piece of paper in her trembling hands. Gabriel immediately approached her, his tail wagging with an enthusiasm that surprised even Father Bill. "Father Matthews," Susan said, her voice barely steady. "I heard about what's been happening at the church. I drove down from Nashville as soon as I could. I need to show you something that Benjamin left with me before he disappeared." Father Bill invited her into his study, where Gabriel positioned himself protectively beside Susan's chair. She unfolded the paper with careful reverence, revealing a handwritten letter in Benjamin's familiar script. "He gave this to me the day before he left Millbrook," Susan explained. "He made me promise not to share it unless something happened that might vindicate his name. He said if God ever saw fit to reveal the truth, I would know when the time was right." Father Bill read the letter aloud, his voice growing more strained with each paragraph. "My dearest Susan, if you are reading this letter, then perhaps the truth has finally begun to surface. I leave Millbrook not because I'm guilty of the accusations against me, but because my continued presence only brings pain to the community I love. I discovered financial irregularities in the church accounts, evidence that someone has been stealing from our congregation for months. When I confronted this person privately, offering them a chance to make restitution quietly, they responded by destroying my reputation instead. I have copies of the financial records hidden in our father's old toolbox in your basement. I pray that someday justice will prevail and our church family can heal from the wounds that my departure has caused. Your loving brother, Benjamin." The silence that followed was broken only by Gabriel's soft whimpering. As if the puppy could sense the profound sadness that filled the room, Susan wiped her eyes with a tissue Father Bill offered. her composure gradually returning as she continued her story. "I kept that toolbox all these years, never looking inside because I trusted Benjamin's judgment about timing. But when I heard about the puppy finding the chalice, when I learned that people were finally questioning what really happened, I knew this was the moment Benjamin had been waiting for." Father Bill felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The financial records Susan described could provide the evidence needed to expose the real criminal, but they would also devastate another family in the congregation. He thought of Harold Whitfield's confession during the board meeting, the genuine remorse in the older man's voice, and wondered how many more revelations the community could endure. Gabriel suddenly stood and walked to the window, his attention focused intently on something outside. Father Bill and Susan joined him, looking out to see Harold Whitfield approaching the rectory with slow, deliberate steps. The elderly man's face wore an expression of grim determination, and he carried a manila envelope in his weathered hands. "It appears," Father Bill said quietly, "that we may not be the only ones preparing for a moment of truth." Harold knocked on the door with the same measured precision he had brought to all his activities as church treasurer. When Father Bill answered, the older man looked past him to Susan Crawford, his face crumbling with recognition and remorse. "Susan," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion, "I didn't know you were here, but perhaps it's fitting. Perhaps it's time for all of us to face what I've done to your family." Gabriel positioned himself between Harold and the others, not as a barrier but as a bridge, his presence somehow encouraging honesty while offering the promise of forgiveness. Harold entered the study and placed his envelope on Father Bill's desk with shaking hands. "I've been carrying this for 2 years," Harold began, "waiting for the courage to confess what I really did to Benjamin Crawford. When that puppy found the chalice, when I saw the look in his eyes, I knew I couldn't hide anymore." The envelope contained detailed financial records showing how Harold had systematically embezzled money from various church accounts over a period of 18 months. The amounts were not enormous by corporate standards, but for a small church like St. Matthew's, they represented thousands of dollars in desperately needed funds. "Benjamin discovered what I was doing during his routine review of youth program expenses," Harold continued, his voice barely audible. "Instead of exposing me immediately, he approached me privately, offered to help me find a way to repay the money without destroying my reputation. He said he understood that people sometimes make mistakes when they're desperate." Susan gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white with emotion. "And you repaid his kindness by destroying his life." Harold's composure finally broke completely. "I was terrified of losing everything, my reputation, my standing in the community, my family's respect. When Benjamin gave me that chance, I should have been grateful. Instead, I panicked. I started the rumors about his inappropriate behavior with the young women. I planted the chalice under his pew. I convinced myself that sacrificing one person was better than admitting my own guilt." Father Bill felt Gabriel press against his leg, the small animal's warmth offering comfort in the face of such devastating betrayal. The puppy's presence seemed to remind him that even in the darkest moments, redemption remained possible. "Harold," Father Bill said gently, "what you did was unconscionable, but your willingness to confess now shows that you haven't lost your soul entirely. The question is what we do with this truth, how we begin to heal the damage that's been done." Susan looked at Harold with a mixture of anger and pity. "My brother has been living in exile for 2 years because of your cowardice. He lost his home, his job, his community, everything that mattered to him. How do we even begin to address that level of harm?" Gabriel walked slowly to Harold's chair and placed his small paw on the older man's knee, a gesture that somehow conveyed both judgment and the possibility of grace. Harold looked down at the puppy through his tears, seeing perhaps for the first time the depth of forgiveness that true faith could offer. "I don't know if Benjamin can ever forgive me," Harold whispered, but I have to try to make this right. I have to find him and tell him the truth, publicly acknowledge what I did, and take responsibility for the consequences." As the three humans grappled with the magnitude of Harold's confession, Gabriel returned to his favorite spot by the window, his work as a catalyst for truth nearly complete. The small animal seemed to understand that while justice was being served, the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead, finding Benjamin Crawford and beginning the long process of healing a community torn apart by fear, greed, and the devastating power of lies. Sunday morning arrived with the weight of revelation hanging over St. Matthew's Episcopal Church like a storm cloud ready to burst. Father Bill had made the difficult decision to address Harold Whitfield's confession publicly during the service, believing that healing could only begin with complete transparency. Gabriel, as if sensing the momentous nature of the day, had positioned himself earlier than usual in Benjamin Crawford's pew, his alert posture suggesting he too was waiting for something significant to unfold. The sanctuary filled more slowly than usual, as word of Harold's confession had spread through Millbrook's gossip network with devastating efficiency. Some parishioners arrived with expressions of shock and dismay, while others carried the burden of their own guilt for having believed and perpetuated the lies about Benjamin. Margaret Foster sat in her customary place behind Benjamin's pew, her eyes red with tears she had shed throughout the sleepless night. Harold Whitfield entered the sanctuary with his wife Emma, their faces bearing the weight of public shame that would forever alter their standing in the community. Emma had learned of her husband's confession only the night before, and her devastation was evident in every line of her 75-year-old face. They took seats near the back of the church, as far from Gabriel and Benjamin's pew as possible, though the puppy's presence seemed to fill the entire sanctuary with an energy of expectation. Dr. Chen arrived with his usual punctuality, but today he was accompanied by someone unexpected, a tall man in his late 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes that held deep sadness, walked beside the veterinarian. Several congregation members gasped audibly as they recognized Benjamin Crawford, looking older and more weathered than when he had left Millbrook 2 years earlier. Gabriel's reaction was immediate and extraordinary. The puppy leaped from Benjamin's pew and raced down the center aisle, his joyful barking echoing through the sanctuary as he threw himself into Benjamin's arms. The man knelt to embrace the small animal, tears streaming down his face as Gabriel licked his cheeks with unbridled enthusiasm. "Hello, old friend," Benjamin whispered to the puppy, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent sanctuary. "I've missed you too." The congregation sat in stunned silence as the truth of Gabriel's identity became clear. This was not a stray puppy who had mysteriously appeared at their church. This was Benjamin Crawford's dog, who had somehow found his way back to the place where his master had experienced both his greatest joy and deepest pain. Sarah Beth Morrison was the first to recover her voice. "Benjamin," she called out, rising from her pew, "how did Gabriel find us? How did he know to come here?" Benjamin stood slowly, Gabriel cradled in his arms, and faced the congregation that had cast him out. "Gabriel disappeared from my apartment in Knoxville 3 weeks ago. I searched everywhere, posted flyers, contacted animal shelters, but he had simply vanished. I never imagined he would find his way back here, back to the church we both love so much." Father Bill approached from the altar, his own eyes bright with tears. "Benjamin, Dr. Chen found you. He tracked down your veterinary records, discovered where you had relocated. We needed you to know that the truth has finally come to light." "Doctor, Chen told me about Harold's confession," Benjamin replied, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "He told me about the chalice, about the financial records, about everything. But honestly, seeing Gabriel sitting in our old pew, seeing him lead you to the truth we both knew was buried here, that's the real miracle." Harold Whitfield rose shakily from his seat, supported by his wife Emma. The elderly man made his way slowly down the aisle, each step representing a painful journey toward the accountability he had avoided for 2 years. When he reached Benjamin, Harold fell to his knees in front of the entire congregation. "Benjamin," Harold said, his voice breaking, "I have destroyed everything good in your life because of my own cowardice and greed. I stole from our church, and when you offered me mercy, I repaid your kindness with betrayal. I spread lies about you, turned this community against you, and drove you from the only home you had ever known. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for your mercy." Benjamin looked down at the broken man before him. Gabriel still nestled in his arms as if providing strength for this moment of ultimate test. The sanctuary was so quiet that the soft sound of Gabriel's contented breathing seemed amplified in the sacred space. "Harold," Benjamin said softly, "I forgave you 2 years ago. Even before I knew whether the truth would ever come to light, carrying anger and resentment would have poisoned my soul far more than your lies ever damaged my reputation." The gasp that arose from the congregation was audible, but Benjamin continued, "What hurt me most wasn't the loss of my home or my job, or even my standing in this community. What hurt me most was losing my church family, the people I had shared worship and fellowship with for over 20 years. You didn't just steal money, Harold. You stole my spiritual home." Gabriel stirred in Benjamin's arms and looked directly at Harold, his brown eyes holding no judgment, only the pure acceptance that had characterized his presence in the church from the beginning. The puppy's expression seemed to offer Harold what Benjamin's words had begun, the possibility of redemption even in the face of unforgivable betrayal. Margaret Foster rose from her pew and walked toward Benjamin, her steps deliberate and purposeful. "Benjamin, we all failed you. Every person in this sanctuary who believed the lies, who whispered the gossip, who turned away when you needed our support most. We are all complicit in what happened to you." One by one, other members of the congregation began to stand. Eleanor Richardson left her organ bench and joined the growing group around Benjamin. Dorothy Walsh, despite her advanced age, made her way forward with tears streaming down her cheeks. Even those who had been most resistant to Gabriel's presence now found themselves drawn to participate in this moment of collective confession and healing. Sarah Beth Morrison approached with her husband Jake, their young faces reflecting the shame of a community grappling with its own capacity for injustice. "Benjamin, I was just starting college when all this happened, but I heard the rumors, believed them, never questioned them. I'm so sorry for the pain our silence caused you." Benjamin set Gabriel down gently, and the puppy immediately positioned himself at Benjamin's feet, as if guarding the man he had worked so hard to vindicate. "Your apologies mean more to me than you can know," Benjamin said, addressing the entire group. "But what matters most is that you learn from this experience, that you remember how quickly fear and suspicion can destroy innocent lives, and that you choose courage and truth over comfort and assumptions." Father Bill stepped forward, his pastoral heart breaking for all the pain that could have been avoided if they had simply demanded evidence before accepting accusations. "Benjamin, I failed you as your pastor. I should have defended you, should have demanded proof, should have stood between you and the mob mentality that developed. Will you forgive me?" "Of course." "Father Bill," Benjamin replied without hesitation, "you were trying to protect everyone, including me. Sometimes the kindest thing a pastor can do is allow someone to leave before the situation becomes even more destructive." Gabriel suddenly barked once, sharply, drawing everyone's attention. The puppy had moved to Harold, who was still kneeling in the aisle, and placed his small paw on the older man's hand. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that even the most skeptical observers couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. Harold looked up at Benjamin through his tears. "What happens now? How do I even begin to make amends for what I've stolen from you?" Benjamin reached down and helped Harold to his feet, Gabriel watching approvingly from beside them. You make public restitution for the money you stole. You tell the truth to anyone who will listen about what really happened. And you learn to forgive yourself, because that's the only way any of us can move forward. The service that followed was unlike any in St. Matthew's history. Instead of Father Bill's prepared sermon, the congregation engaged in an open discussion about forgiveness, accountability, and the courage required to confront uncomfortable truths. Gabriel moved freely throughout the sanctuary, offering comfort to those who wept and encouragement to those who struggled with their own guilt. As the service concluded, Benjamin made an announcement that surprised everyone present. I've accepted a position as youth pastor at a church in Nashville, he said, but I'll be keeping my apartment in Knoxville. Gabriel and I will be returning to St. Matthew's regularly because this is still our spiritual home, and home is where healing happens. The congregation erupted in applause, and Gabriel barked joyfully as if he understood that his mission had been successful. Father Bill wiped tears from his eyes as he watched his community begin the hard work of rebuilding trust and learning to love more courageously. In the weeks that followed, Harold Whitfield made full financial restitution to the church and publicly acknowledged his crimes. He faced legal consequences for his embezzlement, but the congregation rallied around Emma, ensuring she was cared for during Harold's incarceration. Benjamin Crawford resumed his place in St. Matthew's community gradually, his gentle spirit helping to heal wounds that had festered for too long. Gabriel became the unofficial mascot of St. Matthew's, his presence a daily reminder that truth has a way of surfacing and that love is stronger than fear. Children in the youth group, now led once again by Benjamin, often said that Gabriel had been sent by angels to fix what broken humans had damaged. As Father Bill often reflected in the months that followed, sometimes God's most profound miracles come in the smallest packages, with 4 paws and a heart full of unconditional love. Gabriel had done more than expose a criminal and vindicate an innocent man. He had taught an entire community that redemption is always possible, that healing can emerge from the darkest betrayals, and that sometimes the path to forgiveness requires the simple faith of a puppy who refuses to give up on the goodness of human hearts. Dear friends, we hope that Benjamin and Gabriel's story has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. Their journey reminds us that truth always finds a way to surface and that love and forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. If this story moved you, we have created a special playlist filled with equally powerful tales of redemption and hope. You can find it by clicking to your left. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up if Benjamin and Gabriel's story resonated with you. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the beautiful complexity of human nature and the extraordinary ways that love transforms our lives. We can't wait to see you in the comments section, sharing your own thoughts about faith, forgiveness, and the miraculous ways that truth prevails. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and we'll see you in our next story.